The gunshot cracked through the Harlem night like a betrayal-given sound. One sharp report. No warning, no argument. Just the echo bouncing off brick and steel, slicing through the silence of 135th Street. Men who had stood beside each other for years froze where they stood. Cards fluttered from a folding table, a bottle tipped and shattered, whiskey bleeding across concrete like an accusation. Bumpy Johnson did not flinch. He stood under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, his coat collar turned up against the autumn cold, his eyes fixed on the man who had just pulled the trigger. The smoke from the revolver curled upward between them, thin and uncertain, like it didn't yet understand what it had done. In Harlem, a gunshot was never just a gunshot. It was a message, and this one said loyalty was dead. The man holding the gun, someone who had eaten at Bumpy's table, someone who had benefited from his protection, let his hand tremble just enough to give himself away. He hadn't meant to miss. The bullet had torn into the brick wall inches from Bumpy's head, spraying dust and mortar into the night. A warning shot. Or a test. Either way, the rules had changed. Bumpy Johnson slowly removed his gloves, one finger at a time, deliberate as a judge preparing to speak. Around them, Harlem held its breath. Everyone there understood what that moment meant. When a man took a shot at the king and lived long enough to watch his reaction, history was about to be written, one way or another. Bumpy's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm. Too calm. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. No shouting, no threats, just a statement of fact. Because Bumpy Johnson did not need to raise his voice to command Harlem. His power wasn't in noise. It was in inevitability. And everyone standing there knew it. By the time that gun went off, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, had already become something more than a man. He was a fixture. A force. A name spoken carefully in police precincts and back rooms alike. In Harlem, his presence was felt the way weather was felt, sometimes gentle, sometimes destructive, but never ignorable. The streets of Harlem in those years were alive with contradictions. Jazz spilled out of basement clubs, while poverty pressed against every doorway. Politicians made promises during the day and cut deals at night. White-controlled institutions dictated terms, but black neighborhoods enforced their own order, often through men like Bumpy. He wasn't born into power. He carved his way into it. Raised on stories of resistance and hardened by years in the underworld, Bumpy learned early that respect was currency. And like any currency, it had to be defended against counterfeit. He read poetry as easily as he read men, understood both the brutality of the streets and the subtleties of human weakness. That combination made him dangerous in ways bullets alone could never manage. By the time the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, Harlem belonged to him in all the ways that mattered. Numbers runners answered to his people. Nightclubs operated under his protection. Disputes were brought to him not because he was the most violent, but because his word carried weight. And he had rules. Loyalty was not optional. Disrespect was not tolerated. And betrayal was the one sin that could not be forgiven. Those rules had kept Harlem stable in an era when stability was rare. They also kept Bumpy alive. Until that night. The man who fired that shot wasn't an outsider or a rival gangster trying to make a name. That would have been simple. This was something far more dangerous. A fracture from within. A man who believed that Bumpy's power had grown too large. That the old order was shifting. That maybe the king had grown too comfortable. Whispers had been circulating for weeks. Quiet conversations in back rooms. Glances held a second too long. Money not arriving when it should. Small things. The kind of small things that told a seasoned man like Bumpy Johnson that someone, somewhere, was calculating. But calculations had consequences. Harlem had seen challenges before. Italian mobs testing boundaries, corrupt officials trying to flex authority, ambitious young men mistaking confidence for invincibility. None of them ended well. Because Bumpy understood something fundamental about power. It only existed if people believed it would be enforced. And enforcement didn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looked like patience. That patience had just been tested. The crowd around them stayed frozen, unsure whether to run or bear witness. This wasn't just about two men anymore. This was about whether Bumpy Johnson still ruled Harlem, or whether his empire had begun to crack. Police sirens wailed faintly in the distance, a reminder that the law was always nearby, but never truly present when it mattered. This was a street matter, a Harlem matter. And whatever happened next would not be decided in a courtroom. It would be decided right here, under a flickering street lamp, with loyalty bleeding out onto the pavement. Bumpy stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the man with the gun, close enough to smell the fear. Close enough that everyone watching understood. If another shot was fired, there would be no warning this time. "You took something from me tonight," Bumpy said quietly. "And you don't even know what it was yet." The man swallowed hard, because he did know. He had taken the illusion that betrayal could be survived. And in Bumpy Johnson's Harlem, that illusion was the most dangerous thing of all. The night wasn't over. It was just beginning. The man with the gun didn't lower it. Not right away. That hesitation told Bumpy Johnson everything he needed to know. Fear was present, but so was resolve. And resolve, when paired with fear, often meant someone had already crossed a line in their mind long before they crossed it in the street. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was the final step of a longer journey, one that began with doubt and ended with a gunshot meant to rewrite the rules. Bumpy turned slightly, just enough to let the others see his face. Calm, focused, almost disappointed. "Everybody else," he said, voice steady. "Go home." No one moved. He didn't repeat himself. One by one, men backed away. Some hesitated, wanting to stay, wanting to be part of history. But history under Bumpy Johnson wasn't something you watched. It was something that swept you up and judged whether you survived. Shoes scraped against pavement. A car door opened, then closed. The street slowly emptied until only a handful remained. Bumpy, the shooter, and two men who had known them both long enough to understand what was coming. The shooter's name was Curtis "Slim" Porter. Slim had grown up a few blocks east, hungry and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who learned early how to disappear into a crowd and reappear with pockets full of other people's money. Bumpy had seen something in him years earlier: discipline, ambition, intelligence. He'd brought Slim in, given him work, protection, purpose. And Slim had repaid him with patience. Because betrayal, when it came, was rarely loud at first. It started with missed meetings, with questioning looks, with suggestions that maybe Bumpy was getting too close to certain politicians, too comfortable dealing with white power brokers who didn't live in Harlem and didn't bleed there. Slim listened when others talked. He nodded when grievances were aired. He didn't argue. He didn't object. He waited. Others were restless too. Younger men. Men who hadn't come up in the lean years, who didn't remember Harlem before order, before rules. They saw Bumpy as a gatekeeper instead of a shield. They saw money flowing upward and told themselves they deserved more of it. Slim became their voice. Not openly, never openly. But in whispered conversations, he planted the idea that loyalty was outdated, that power could be redistributed, that Bumpy Johnson's reign wasn't eternal, it was just long. And tonight, under that street lamp, Slim had decided to collect. "You should step back," Slim said, trying to sound firm. "This doesn't have to go any further." Bumpy studied him for a moment, not with anger, with curiosity. "Funny thing about that," Bumpy replied, "you already made sure it did." Slim's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. The barrel wavered. This was the moment where most men made mistakes, raised their voice, threatened violence, tried to reclaim authority through force alone. Bumpy did none of that. Instead, he spoke softly, forcing Slim to lean in, forcing him to listen. "You ever wonder why I never had to pull a gun on you?" Bumpy asked. Slim frowned. "This ain't the time." I'm asking you, Bumpy said. You think it's because I'm soft? Silence stretched between them. The night air felt heavier now, pressing in. No, Slim muttered. That's right, Bumpy said. It's because men like you always tell on yourselves. You start believing your own whispers. Start thinking patience is weakness. And by the time you raise a gun, you've already lost. Slim shook his head. You don't know what you're talking about. But his voice betrayed him, because Bumpy did know. He knew Slim had been talking to people outside Harlem. He knew money had changed hands, quietly, carefully. He knew promises had been made that could never be kept, because men who bought betrayal never intended to honor it. Bumpy took another step forward. Slim didn't fire. That was the difference between someone who wanted power and someone who understood it. You think this is about you and me, Bumpy continued. But this is bigger than that. This is about whether Harlem belongs to people who live here, or people who see it as a ledger. Slim's jaw tightened. You don't get to decide that alone anymore. There it was. Not anger. Not desperation. Resentment. Slim believed he was correcting an imbalance. That his act wasn't treason, it was progress. That history would thank him for being bold enough to pull the trigger where others only complained. Bumpy nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a well-made argument. Then he said, You know what the saddest part is? Slim didn't answer. You could have just left, Bumpy said. Taken your money, started fresh somewhere else. But you didn't want to walk away. You wanted to replace me. A distant siren grew louder, then faded again. The city moving on, indifferent to the reckoning about to unfold. Slim's eyes flicked toward the corner, calculating exits, witnesses, outcomes. The gun was still up, but the confidence behind it was gone. Because Bumpy Johnson hadn't threatened him. He'd judged him. And judgment, once delivered, could not be appealed. What happens now? Slim asked quietly. Bumpy looked at the gun, then back at Slim. Now, he said, you find out what that shot really bought you. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Every second stretched tighter than the last, waiting for something, anything to break. And somewhere deep in Slim's chest, the realization finally settled in. The gunshot hadn't ended Bumpy Johnson's reign. It had only guaranteed that whatever came next would be final. The gun finally lowered. Not because Slim Porter had found mercy, but because his arm had begun to ache under the weight of a decision he could no longer carry. The barrel dipped toward the pavement, and with it went the last illusion that he was in control of this moment. Bumpy Johnson noticed everything. He noticed the way Slim exhaled, slow and shallow. The way his shoulders slumped just enough to betray relief. Relief was dangerous. Relief made men sloppy. Bumpy stepped past the gun as if it were no longer relevant. That alone sent a message to anyone who might one day hear this story told. Guns were tools. Fear was temporary. Authority was something else entirely. You ever hear the story about the man who shot at the king and missed? Bumpy asked, turning his back to Slim as he walked a few paces away. Slim's eyes widened. Don't turn around, he said instinctively. Bumpy stopped, but he didn't turn back. That's the thing, Bumpy replied. A real king doesn't have to. The two men who had remained, veterans of Harlem's underworld, shifted uneasily. They weren't guards. They weren't executioners. They were witnesses. And they understood their role. Bumpy turned slowly now, facing Slim again. There are only two reasons a man fires a warning shot, he said. Either he doesn't want to kill, or he's afraid to. Slim clenched his jaw. You don't know what I want. I know what you did, Bumpy said, and that's enough. Bumpy gestured with a subtle flick of his hand. One of the witnesses stepped forward, not aggressively, just present. Another moved to Slim's left, cutting off the street behind him. No sudden moves. No rush. This wasn't an ambush. It was a closing circle. You've been talking to men who don't know Harlem, Bumpy continued. Men who think this place is just numbers on paper. They promise you power because they don't understand it themselves. Slim laughed bitterly. You think you're the only one who can protect this place? I think I'm the only one who has, Bumpy replied. The words landed harder than any blow. Because they were true. When white gangs tried to muscle in, Bumpy pushed back. When police pressure threatened to choke the neighborhood dry, Bumpy negotiated. Sometimes with money, sometimes with leverage, sometimes with quiet intimidation that never made the papers. When young men needed work, he gave it. When families needed help, he made sure envelopes appeared without names attached. It wasn't charity, it was structure. And Slim had benefited from all of it. You wanted a revolution, Bumpy said, but you didn't bring one. You brought chaos. Slim's grip tightened around the gun again, not in threat but in desperation. You don't get to decide my fate, Bumpy nodded. You're right. That answer confused Slim. Confusion was worse than fear. You decided it yourself, Bumpy continued, the moment you pulled that trigger. Bumpy reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, not for a gun, for a handkerchief. He wiped the dust from his cheek where Brick had exploded inches away earlier. You know what loyalty buys a man in Harlem? Bumpy asked. Longevity. He folded the handkerchief neatly and returned it to his pocket. And you spent yours. One of the witnesses stepped closer now, speaking for the first time. Boss, people are going to ask questions. Bumpy didn't look at him. People always do. Slim swallowed. So what? You going to kill me right here? The question hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Bumpy's eyes hardened, not with rage but with something colder. Calculation. If I kill you, he said, they'll say I was afraid of you. Slim scoffed. Nobody would believe that. Bumpy's gaze snapped to him. Belief is built. So is doubt. Bumpy stepped closer again, close enough that Slim could see his reflection in Bumpy's eyes. Close enough to feel the gravity of a man who had outlasted everyone who tried to rush him. You want to know what really ends loyalty? Bumpy asked quietly. Slim didn't respond. Disrespect, Bumpy said. Not to me, to the rules that kept you alive long enough to make this mistake. Bumpy straightened, put the gun on the ground. Slim hesitated. Now! Slowly, carefully, Slim bent down and placed the revolver on the pavement. It looked smaller there, harmless, almost pathetic. One of the men kicked it away. The power dynamic shifted instantly, not with violence, but with surrender. Bumpy exhaled through his nose. You're going to walk away from Harlem tonight. Slim looked up sharply. What? You're going to leave, Bumpy repeated. No money, no protection, no name worth remembering. And you're going to live with the knowledge that the only reason you're breathing is because I decided your death would teach the wrong lesson. Slim laughed, short, incredulous. You think that's worse than killing me? Bumpy met his gaze. I know it is. Because in Harlem, being forgotten was a fate worse than death. You step foot back here, Bumpy continued, or you let my name come out of your mouth in rooms I don't sit in, and there won't be a warning shot next time. Slim nodded slowly. The fight had drained out of him. The ambition, too. As the two men escorted Slim toward the corner, Bumpy remained under the street lamp, alone now. The light buzzed overhead, indifferent. A single gunshot had tried to end loyalty in his empire. Instead, it had clarified it. But the story wasn't finished yet, because Harlem would wake up the next morning with questions, and Bumpy Johnson would have to answer them, not with words, but with consequence. By morning, Harlem was already talking. It always did. Stories moved faster than police reports, faster than truth, faster even than fear. By sunrise, the gunshot on 135th Street had become 10 different versions of the same legend, each shaped by who told it and what they needed it to mean. Some said Slim Porter tried to take the throne and failed. Others whispered that Bumpy Johnson stared down death and made it blink first. A few insisted blood had been spilled and hidden before dawn. Bumpy let the rumors breathe. He understood something most men in power never did. Control the outcome, not the noise. Still, noise demanded response. By late morning, Bumpy was seated in the back room of a Lenox Avenue barbershop, one of the oldest neutral grounds in Harlem. The mirrors reflected more than faces there. They reflected alliances, grievances, calculations. Men filtered in quietly, one by one. Numbers runners, club owners, street captains, men who needed to know whether the ground beneath them was still solid. The door closed. The room settled. Bumpy sat at the head of the table, hat resting beside him, hands folded. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence work for him, the way it always had. Finally, someone cleared his throat. "We hearing all kinds of things, Bump." Bumpy nodded. "That's usually how you know something important happened." A few uneasy chuckles. No one laughed too long. "Slim Porter fired a gun last night," Bumpy said evenly. "That part's true." Eyes locked on him. "He fired it at me," Bumpy continued. "That part's also true." The room stiffened. This wasn't gossip anymore. This was confirmation. "He missed," Bumpy said, and he walked away. Murmurs broke out, confusion, disbelief, even concern. Bumpy raised a hand. Silence returned instantly. "Let me be clear," he said. "Slim didn't walk away because he was strong. He walked away because killing him would have been easy. That landed harder than any threat. Killing him would have satisfied anger," Bumpy continued, "but it wouldn't have solved the problem." A man near the wall spoke up. "What problem?" Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "The problem where men forget why order exists." No one argued. "Loyalty isn't about fear," Bumpy said. "Fear fades. Loyalty is about knowing where you stand, and knowing the rules don't bend just because you're impatient." He paused, letting his eyes move slowly from face to face. Slim wanted power without responsibility, wanted respect without earning it, and he thought one gunshot could buy that. Bumpy shook his head. "That's not how this works." A younger man shifted in his seat. "What if he talks?" Bumpy's gaze snapped to him, not angry, just sharp. "About what?" Bumpy asked. "That he shot at me and lived? That he was spared because he wasn't worth the lesson his death would teach?" The young man looked down. "He doesn't have a story anyone wants," Bumpy continued. "And the men he was talking to, if they were smart, they're already pretending they never knew his name." That was the truth. Outsiders never protected traitors. They used them and erased them. Bumpy leaned back. "This is the last time I'll address this," he said. "There is no open seat. There is no divided authority. And there is no future in this business for men who confuse ambition with entitlement." He stood then, signaling the meeting was over. But before anyone could leave, he added one final thing. "Harlem stays standing because we stand together. Anyone who forgets that won't be reminded twice." No threats, no raised voice, just fact. The consequences rippled outward fast. Within days, Slim Porter vanished from every circle that mattered. His name stopped coming up in conversations. Doors closed where they once opened. Jobs dried up. Friends stopped answering. That kind of exile was intentional. It served as a living warning. Men noticed. They also noticed something else. Bumpy Johnson hadn't tightened his grip. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't turned paranoid or cruel. He'd stayed steady. That steadiness reassured Harlem more than any show of force ever could. Police, too, took notice. Intelligence reports mentioned internal instability that never materialized. A potential fracture that healed itself. To the outside world, Bumpy's empire looked unshaken. Stronger even. Because now everyone understood the line more clearly. Disrespect didn't always end in death, but it always ended in loss. And loss, in Harlem, was permanent. Late one evening, Bumpy stood at his apartment window, looking out over the neighborhood. Lights flickered on and off. Music drifted up from somewhere below. Life continuing. One of his closest associates stood behind him. "You could have ended it," the man said quietly. Bumpy didn't turn. Ending things is easy. He watched a couple walk arm in arm down the street. "Building something that survives anger," Bumpy continued. "That's harder." The associate nodded. "You think this'll hold?" Bumpy finally turned, eyes thoughtful. "It already has," he said, because loyalty hadn't been restored by fear. It had been reinforced by principle, and that was something no gunshot could ever undo. Harlem didn't erupt after the gunshot. It stabilized. That was the part outsiders never understood. They expected chaos when a challenge to power failed. They expected retaliation, bodies, sirens, headlines. But what followed instead was something quieter, something far more unsettling to anyone hoping to see Bumpy Johnson weaken. Order returned almost immediately. Numbers operations resumed without interruption. Club owners paid on time. Street disputes were settled before they escalated. Even the police noticed a change, not an increase in violence, but a tightening of discipline. Harlem had absorbed the shock and corrected itself. That was justice in Bumpy Johnson's world, not vengeance. Correction. The men closest to him felt it first. Meetings became shorter, instructions clearer. There was no suspicion in Bumpy's voice, no second-guessing. He trusted his people, but trust, once tested, was now measured with greater precision. Anyone expecting a purge was disappointed. Anyone expecting a vacuum was mistaken. One afternoon, Bumpy walked through a small grocery on 7th Avenue, nodding to the owner as he passed. The man slipped a paper bag across the counter, nothing flashy, just fresh fruit and bread. "On the house," the owner said. Bumpy shook his head and placed money down anyway. "A man pays his way," he said. The exchange was small, but it mattered. Word traveled. Respect was still mutual. Authority hadn't become exploitation. That distinction mattered to Harlem. The community reaction was subtle but unmistakable. People spoke Bumpy's name with renewed certainty. Not fear, not myth. Trust. They knew something serious had happened. They knew a line had been crossed. And they knew the response had been measured, not reckless. A local pastor said it best during a quiet conversation behind his church. "He didn't spill blood to make a point," the pastor said. "He spared it." That kind of restraint carried its own weight. Behind the scenes, consequences were still being enforced. Men who had entertained Slim Porter's ideas found themselves reassigned, moved away from money, removed from influence. No explanations given, none needed. They understood. Bumpy didn't humiliate them publicly. He didn't accuse. He simply made it clear they were no longer trusted with leverage. That was justice too. Slim Porter's fate became a lesson told carefully, without embellishment. He wasn't hunted. He wasn't made into a martyr. He was erased. And erasure in Harlem was final. Some said he tried his luck in Chicago. Others claimed he drifted south, chasing work that never lasted. The truth mattered less than the outcome. He never returned, and no one tried to follow his path again. The shift in power dynamics reached beyond Harlem. Italian crime families who had once considered testing Bumpy's boundaries took note of the response. They understood violence, but they also understood discipline. A man who could absorb betrayal without imploding was a man not easily manipulated. Police captains adjusted their expectations. Informants brought back less chatter about internal weakness. Pressure strategies were revised. Whatever crack they thought they'd seen had sealed itself. Bumpy Johnson's authority had survived not because he crushed dissent, but because he exposed it and rendered it ineffective. One evening, a young numbers runner was brought before him for skimming. The boy was shaking, expecting the worst. Bumpy listened, asked questions, confirmed facts. Then he said, "You pay back what you took, and you don't do it again." The boy blinked. "That's it?" "That's it," Bumpy replied. "Don't confuse mercy with permission." The boy didn't. Justice wasn't about cruelty, it was about clarity. That philosophy radiated outward. Men knew where they stood, They knew the cost of stepping out of line and the benefit of staying in it. For the first time since the gunshot, Bumpy allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. Not pride, not relief. Understanding. He knew something had shifted, not just in Harlem, but in how he would be remembered. A single gunshot had challenged his empire. His response had defined it. Late one night, Bumpy sat alone, reading by lamplight. A book of poetry lay open in his hands. Outside, the city hummed, alive and unpredictable. A knock came at the door. One of his men entered. "Words traveling," he said. "People saying things." Bumpy didn't look up. People always say things. "They're saying you showed restraint," the man continued. "That you proved something." Bumpy turned a page. "I didn't prove anything," he said. "I reminded them." "Of what?" "That power isn't loud," Bumpy replied, "and loyalty isn't blind." The man nodded, understanding. As he left, Bumpy closed the book and stared at the lamp, its glow steady and controlled. Like him. Because justice, when done right, didn't need to announce itself. It simply reshaped the world around it. Years later, men would still talk about that night, but never the way they talked about massacres or bloodbaths. They talked about it the way seasoned men talk about storms that changed the land. Because what happened after that single gunshot didn't just preserve Bumpy Johnson's empire, it refined it. Harlem entered a quieter era. Not peaceful, not clean, but balanced. The kind of balance that only existed when everyone understood the consequences of disturbing it. Young men coming up heard the story early, usually whispered by someone older, someone who had been there or knew someone who was. They learned the lesson before they ever touched real power. Bumpy Johnson was no longer just feared. He was studied. Men began to describe him differently, not as a tyrant, not as a gangster chasing territory, but as an arbiter, a man who understood the long game, a man who knew that authority didn't come from killing challengers, it came from surviving them without losing control. That distinction mattered. In the history of Harlem, many men rose quickly. Fewer stayed. Almost none evolved. Bumpy did. He became a figure even his enemies respected, sometimes quietly, sometimes begrudgingly. White mob bosses learned that pressure tactics failed. Law enforcement learned that intimidation only hardened him. Community leaders learned that while he operated in the shadows, his decisions shaped the daylight. And the streets learned something deeper. They learned that loyalty wasn't enforced with bullets. It was earned through consistency. The story of Slim Porter didn't end with his disappearance. It ended every time a young man hesitated before betraying the hand that fed him. It ended every time someone chose patience over ambition, structure over chaos. That was Bumpy's real victory. Historians would later note that Harlem avoided a prolonged internal war during a period when similar neighborhoods collapsed under infighting. They would point to economic stability, reduced street violence, a strange but undeniable order. They wouldn't write Bumpy Johnson's name in those reports, but his fingerprints were everywhere. He became a living contradiction, a criminal who enforced restraint, a king who refused to rule through terror, a man who read poetry at night and calculated consequences by day. That single gunshot became a turning point, not because it nearly killed him, but because it revealed him. It showed that his power wasn't reactive, it was deliberate, and that deliberation extended his reign far longer than violence ever could have. In later years, when younger men asked him about betrayal, what it felt like, how to survive it, Bumpy never spoke about Slim Porter by name. He spoke in principles. Betrayal, he once said, is just information delivered too late. Men didn't always understand that, but they remembered it. They remembered that Bumpy Johnson faced down a challenge without flinching, without panic, without losing himself. They remembered that he chose legacy over satisfaction. That choice echoed. By the time age and pressure finally began to weigh on him, Bumpy's legend was already sealed. Not by the number of men he buried, but by the number of wars he prevented. That night on 135th Street, became proof that loyalty could fracture, but it could also be reinforced if handled with discipline and vision. The empire stood, not untouched, but wiser. The men who lived through it carried the lesson into the next generation, whether they meant to or not. Harlem's code shifted slightly that night, less impulsive, more measured. The streets adapted to the standard he set, and standards once set are hard to lower. Bumpy Johnson never called himself a legend. He didn't have to. History did it for him, quietly, decisively, without apology. Because in the end, a single gunshot didn't end loyalty in Bumpy Johnson's empire. It defined it. This story was never about a gun. It was about what happens after the trigger is pulled. When a single gunshot rang out on a Harlem street, it wasn't just aimed at a man. It was aimed at an idea. The idea that loyalty could be bought, that respect could be stolen, that power could be rushed. Bumpy Johnson proved something that night most men never learn in a lifetime. Violence can challenge authority, but only restraint can secure it. He didn't respond with rage. He didn't turn Harlem into a graveyard to make a point. Instead, he showed the community and his enemies that real power doesn't panic when tested. It clarifies. It corrects. It endures. That gunshot could have started a war. Instead, it ended an argument. An argument about who truly controlled Harlem and why. This wasn't just about one man asserting dominance. It was about preserving order in a place where chaos was always waiting for an invitation. It was about protecting a community from tearing itself apart over ambition disguised as progress. Bumpy Johnson understood something timeless. Respect lasts longer than fear. Justice carries further than revenge. And loyalty, once broken, reveals more than it destroys. History remembers the loud moments, the bloodshed, the headlines, the trials. But legends are built in quieter decisions, in moments when a man chooses legacy over ego. That night, under a flickering street lamp, Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive betrayal. He transformed it into proof. Proof that sometimes the strongest response is knowing when not to pull the trigger. And that's why his name still carries weight, long after the echo of that gunshot faded into Harlem's past.